Change has been one of the big underlying themes of the day. On one hand, we have these global risks. On the other hand, we have institutions that are not yet updated to deal with them in the right and needed way. So how does change happens, and especially what is the power of visionary thinking to change institutions? That will be the theme right now. And I want to invite two pragmatic visionaries up on stage. Helen Goulden, CEO of the Young Foundation, and Maina, who's co-director of InformAction, a lawyer and human rights activist. Please. You'll sit here, and we'll all be close together. So I'm introducing you as pragmatic visionaries. Who's pragmatic and who's the visionary?
She's both.
She's both. And what are you?
Hanger on.
Hanger on.
Just a hustler.
Helen, do you see yourself as a pragmatic visionary?
I see myself. Is this on? I see myself as pragmatic. Definitely.
Okay.
With aspirations for the future. So my dad used to describe it as sort of having your nose to the wheel but your eyes on the hills. So you're kind of working with what's in front of you but trying to have a bigger vision. But whether it's visionary, what I'm looking for is up to other people, I guess.
And you were saying earlier you're dogmatic, actually.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. I mean, I suppose the thing that I would say I am is that I push agendas and I want to move forward, and I want to move the human rights paradigm and social justice forward. And to that extent, I've done that all my life, and with a lot of setbacks and a lot of hustles and challenges, but we keep moving and keep pushing it.
So when pushing these things forward, what have you learned about change?
Change is the only constant in life, for one, but people are very resistant to change. And generally speaking, people's almost default setting is, let's keep doing things the same way we've been doing them and keep at that. Yet, if you don't, what I've learned is that if you don't change, then change changes you, and you'll be carried off or swept away. Some things definitely have to change, and you've got to keep, in a sense, a vision going and saying, I believe in this, and I think this is the best way for us to move forward.
We need to change microphone.
There you go.
Thank you.
I nod a lot sometimes. It happens, huh? So forgive me for that. So I think change is a constant, and I think we have to constantly confront it and constantly see how we can make it better. And particularly if you're working in social justice, human dignity, human rights, then you know that the project never ends. It never does end. It's a constant battle, it's a constant struggle, it's a constant attempt to keep moving the barriers as far as you can go. Because we don't have a human rights state anywhere in the world. We don't have a world where you can say human dignity has been achieved. So that's a constant. And sometimes what you ask of people is, and what you ask and demand of states and of people is quite dramatic. But you got to do that all the time.
Helen, tell me about the Young Foundation and how the Young Foundation is trying to change things.
Sure. Well, for those of you who don't know, the Young Foundation was set up after Michael Young died, who was a social scientist. He wrote, some of you may know, The Rise of the Meritocracy, which was actually a dystopian look at what the effects of a meritocracy would be.
He coined the term, didn't he?
He coined the term, and it has been continually misappropriated. So it's often seen as being, if you apply IQ, the natural talent that you have with hard work, then good things will come to you. And if you have a society that's focused on privileging those two things, you will end up with a much better society. And still now you see meritocracy and meritocratic described as a good thing. He actually didn't think it was a good thing at all. And when he was writing back in 1956, he said in his book that a meritocracy that had transitioned from an aristocracy, that kind of would create a situation where people who were at the top of society, so those who by dint of sort of their effort, also their opportunity and their IQ, got to the top, that they would feel like they deserved to be there. And that deserving to be there would result in a rebellion against the elites, rising populism, rising nationalism, a rebellion of women, the rise of kind of serfdom, the gig economy, I think it as. So, last year when I joined, it was like, gosh, this is very really prescient. And so it was a fantastic narrative to build on. So when I joined, my first question was, well, okay, so Michael Young very conveniently killed off his narrator at the beginning, at the end of the book. He didn't describe what the next ocracy was. And so I came into the organisation saying, well, okay, if IQ plus effort was the equation of the 20th century, what's the equation for the 21st? Because it's got to be more than that. And so returning really to Michael's young roots, which was basically wandering around the East End of London and trying to find out what people really thought, most of the Young Foundation's activities are focused on trying to understand the stories and the lived experiences of people who live in places, amplifying those to kind of generate social change and social innovation. And then we're sort of sitting, I guess, somewhat separately to some of that work and understanding what national patterns of need and opportunity and stories specifically do we hear from communities that can help policymakers make better decisions, because as many of you will know, we haven't really listened to some of the stories and experiences of many people in the UK, which has probably resulted in where we find ourselves today.
Well, yeah, let's try to avoid the word Brexit for the next 30 minutes. But so this is change from the bottom up, right? Is that's a model you agree with?
Oh yes, in fact, entirely. But I think you can also do. I think real change has to come from both the bottom up and top down. It can't be one or the other. It's not an either-or situation. And I think the work that I do now is really bottom up and trying to engage really poor, desperate communities in Kenya and trying to get them to take up the challenge of their own cause and say, look, this is this is the problem that you identify. If you want a solution, you have to get the solution yourself. So I come from a culture of protesting, so I favor protesting a lot, and I think people should protest as often as they can. And I think all of you guys, within the next 2 weeks, please get out to a protest. It's good for your soul, it's good for your mind, it's good for your
Why is it so good for us?
Because it's an expression, but it's also a combined thing. It's a collective. You don't do it alone. You say, yeah, you can always do a one-person protest, but protests that are effective are always in collectively. And collectivity makes us all better human beings when we are agreeing and pushing. And where I come from, protesting also carries risks. So when you now talk to community and they're saying, these are our problems, we're not getting paid for this, our farms, we're not getting stuff. And then they organize themselves and do a protest. And the police come out, and because a lot of them are very old people who are in the front line, mothers and fathers with small children, the police often don't attack them because it's different. It's not young people. It's a community that's doing it. So it's a good thing to do. But I think the top-down, in a sense, for me, where it has been important and is when you're changing laws and changing constitutions, and that often, I mean, which
you have been very involved in.
It was both a top-down, a bottom-up, and a top-down. And in the 90s, when I was in Kenya, we used to talk about the need for constitutional reform and a new constitution, because the one-party state that we'd had for years and years had changed our entire governance system into an autocratic governance system. So we went into elections and we were getting bad results because we were getting results that would be expected within an autocratic system. The presidency controlled everything. We used to call it the imperial presidency. It's almost like an absolute monarch, although pretending to be elected. So we then decided that, look, everybody's talking about a new constitution, and everybody says it's a good thing, but nobody is having any place they can put their fingers on. So we spent 9 months, a number of us getting social scientists, professors of political science, people who do geography, lawyers, human rights people, all over 9 months drafting and working and learning from different countries across Africa. Eventually, after 9 months, we came out with what we call a proposal for a model constitution. And it was a great moment, because it was the Kenya Human Rights Commission, which I worked in then, and the Law Society of Kenya also got involved in that stage. And this document it's a past our wildest dreams, not because of the content of it, but because it showed Kenyans that a new constitution was possible. And then people went out to the villages, talking to the churches and talking in mosques and getting people talking and interested about the fact, looking at this proposal and look at the current and the then existing constitution and seeing night and day. And that spurred up a movement for constitutional reform. In 1997, we then had a national convention, and we spent 6 months every Saturday on the streets protesting, demanding a new constitution. We started off 50 of us in March 31st, 1997. By the time we're finishing in October, we had about 10,000 people coming out on the streets supporting constitutional reform. The first protest, we were beaten up thoroughly by the police, and it was incredibly, we were beaten up so badly. We made an announcement that we are coming back next week. We were beaten up today, we're coming next weekend. And we came out, there were 200 people, and began getting bigger and bigger. And as people saw that we were serious about this, we were going to take the risks that came with it. And the leadership wasn't sitting in the background, they were actually in the front line. We had some great people who I think are visionaries. We had a church leader, a Reverend Timothy Njoya, who would always come in his cloak and in the front line of it. And it's hard to beat a religious, although he was beaten very seriously, almost an inch of his life. But that also changed things as it goes. So that was, in a sense, a vision of saying we want a new constitution. It didn't happen until 2010. And I think in 2010, I think Kenya got one of the better constitutions in the world. We're now learning that you can have a good document, but implementing it is a different thing. So now we're in the process of trying to work again on people's movements to see how do we force implementation of that constitution, and maybe some changes that may be necessary. But I think the goal still remains to get a country and a governance system that respects the poor, that respects the marginalized, and respects the vulnerable. So we've come a long way, but there's still some aspects that are still bad. And a lot of it, and with all due respect to you, is that we inherited a lot of the colonial system, and it's still very much a part of how we do governance. And African countries across Africa, whether Francophonie or Anglophonie, have difficulty because the British colonial system is so outdated and was so horrible. But it's the only system that the people knew, so it went on even after independence. So there's a whole decolonizational strategy that needs to happen, and a vision that says we've got to treat Africans as human beings, the poorest of the poor, and we haven't yet got there. So, but I think there's a lot of effort within Africa to begin changing this. And what's interesting now is that we begin throwing these the labels of colonialism on the African leadership that doesn't want us. So you guys are just like the British, look at you, you're behaving like the governors and the colonial officers. So that begins to make a difference in the way people go. But it's a long haul struggle. It doesn't change overnight. I think we learned that. And I think we learned that it's a battle for hearts and minds. It's a constant battle. In this era of social media, it's a lot of fake news as well that comes in. We have to combat that, and we constantly have to change tactics, not necessarily strategy, but our tactics have to change and evolve. And we've got to keep alive and focused to it. And the other thing that I've learned is the need for us to bring in new blood and new thinking and young people. Generational change has to happen. And something that we haven't done very well in Africa. As you know, some of our presidents are 90, and when Robert Mugabe retired, he was 90-something. So we don't have a good habit of changing leadership, but it's an important part even within the movements for change, and that people see there's a process of changing and moving on, and the new fresh blood can come in and move those agendas forward.
And in this very long, still ongoing struggle, what role does visionary thinking play?
It's paramount. I mean, keeping your eyes, as Martin Luther King said, keeping your eyes on the prize is fundamental. You've got to keep focused on it. You will have setbacks. You'll move back, and then you go lick your wounds, and you've got to keep your eye and say, what is the vision we want? What is it? In our context in Kenya, I think the vision has been, we want a country that respects the poor and the marginalized. And we want a country where where your dignity is assured because you are alive, not because no other reason. And we want a country where, and in fact, one of the battles we've been having now is beginning to emerge is around LGBT, because there's a whole mythology that people who are LGBT are not Africans, and it's an-African. And then you ask, where do you learn this? And they say, we learn it from the Bible. Say, is that African now? This is not African. How do you say it's African from the Bible as the basis? So we have all these difficulties we have to emerge with, and so we have to, and of course this then presents difficulties between us and the churches, because we have been allies before, but when it comes to these issues, then we become a bit difficult. So it's a whole constant streaming and shifting, bringing new alliances, because you have to keep yourself focused. And so sometimes you work with politicians, sometimes you work with social movements and traders, sometimes you work with the churches, sometimes you work with the mosques. You keep changing your allies, but you have to keep your eyes focused. Where do you want to go? And it's not just, and you can think you have succeeded. And I think a lot of us a lot of us were really happy in 2010 when we had a new constitution and said, now we have a constitution, now we are making it. What we didn't realize, of course, we realized it then, but then once the people in charge of implementing it don't like it, then they do everything to try and finish it off. So that's the challenge we've got, and that's not over yet. But it's you learn. I mean, it's a learning process every time, and I don't think anybody can ever tell you they know the answer or they know this. Here's a template for this process. There's no template. It's all you make it up as you go, trial and error. You make so many mistakes. And you have to shrug, shake your shoulders and move on, because if you don't try, you don't make mistakes. If you try, you are going to make mistakes. You're going to make some awful mistakes that you look back and think, gee, what was I thinking about there? That's important. But it's also important, sorry, I'm taking so long, guys. But the other thing, it's also important to learn to pull back sometimes, and because there's burnout in these processes. There's a lot of burnout. And a lot of people I know are burnt out, and we don't know how to say it. We don't know how to recognize that we are burnt out. You need to pull back and just get off for a bit and let things move on, and then you can come back and re-engage that struggle. So we have to learn a little better these struggles, and I think that's how we go.
So Maina is talking about the spirit of, let's call it, bold experimentation, sort of willingness to make mistakes. Helen, you have a background in the state sector and in politics, and there's often problems with that, isn't it? In that you are punished for making mistakes, so therefore there's a lot of incentives within organizations and politics to just not do anything.
Yes, well, you've just summarised exactly where we are.
Yeah.
So at every single level, and you might also, not using the B word, but you might apply it to that as well.
Brexit.
But we have none of the incentives. No civil servant gets rewarded for making a decision and it going well. It just doesn't happen. And if you do make a decision and it's the wrong one, it's usually fatal. And so everything conspires to create, and this is painting a terrible picture. There are great civil servants and there are obviously great departments, but everything sort of conspires to have a kind of collective irresponsibility. So if nobody makes a decision, then it's nobody's fault, essentially, and everyone's sort of looking up. And everything isn't a ministerial decision, necessarily. And so recently in the UK, there was a fairly big collapse of a private company that was providing services, a large number of services in prisons, in schools across the country. And when it came to, who was the government civil servant in charge of this? They said, well, that seat was sort of temporarily vacant. And of course it was vacant. Who would want to be in that seat? Because that person would have to have made a decision to stop something. And instead, nobody took a decision, and then everything just sort of rolled on. Lots of civil service action now that sort of clearing up and understanding how we won't do it again and those sorts of things. But unless the incentives are aligned, and there are sort of rewards for supporting.
But how can you do that? How can you create those type of incentives? Or is it about culture within an organization?
It's mostly about culture. So I think, as human beings, every time you have a conversation about, well, how do we transform institutions or how do we create institutions, you go round in circles for however number of days, and then it comes down to culture and leadership, and that's what everyone sort of says, and then throws their hands up and says, well, how do you change a culture? And there are all sorts of ways in which you can do it. But fundamentally, organizations are made up of human beings, and human beings don't particularly like change, really. Some of us might say we do, but all of our kind of backstories, reaching back into the caves and wherever, we wanted predictability and we wanted consistency. And so we seek that in our environment all of the time. And if we suspect that change is going to happen and it's going to be done to us, it kicks in another kind of primal urge of fear. And so you end up with a whole set of very human reasons why you don't want change to happen, even when we make our New Year's resolutions. Even when it's in our control, we want to do it, it's entirely our responsibility, we still don't do them. And so if you collect all of those people together who have those kind of inbuilt motivations and prejudices and behaviours, you can't be surprised when an organisation as a whole, of a collection of individuals, doesn't want to change. And so most of what I've spent, whether it's been in the commercial sector or in government or in the philanthropic sector or now in a charity, has been trying to understand how you can connect those people inside the system who are kind of bound by bureaucracies, hierarchies, governance, and for good reasons can't often kind of take a kind of more visionary approach, trying to connect them with people outside in the system who are completely unfettered by all of that and have the capacity to sort of have visionary thinking. And then bringing those two worlds together is probably some of the most important work that can be done. But only when I think there is a mutual respect. So often people, sort of the innovators that I come across, often think that they're inventing civil society and government and that nothing exists. And, you know, with all their brilliance, they're sort of sometimes naive. And on the other side, you know, there's this often kind of, well, you don't understand what it's like to be in a big organisation. So kind of creating a shared language, understanding, and building relationships between different sectors for lots of different reasons is probably one of the things that gets change started.
Do you agree?
Yeah, and I think this is, and the paradox of all that is the fact that human beings have changed so often and so much that the successes that we look at in the world have been about cultural changes. The idea of ending slavery and the slave trade, you know, when people in this part of the world saw black people as pure commodities and goods, and then as work went on, it was changed. We talk about civil rights, we talk about women getting the vote, and women being treated as human beings. You know, that process is still going on. It hasn't yet reached where it needs to be. But it's, you know, but you see the fact that yes, there may be resistance, but I think there's also the capacity in human beings to accept social progress and when it happens, and accept that it is the right thing. And it may sometimes we get there kicking and screaming, but we do accept progress and we accept that people are. And I think there's no better example right now like the LGBT movement. And we're just talking about that in the back room. That the fact that even in many parts of the West, just 6 years ago, no one would ever have said that gay people could marry. It's okay for them to marry. You know, the West had come to accepting this. There's acceptance. They had civil unions and stuff like that. But marriage. And then now everybody says, yeah, it's good. What happened in Ireland just yesterday, where a staunchly Catholic country where, again, 3 years ago, I was in Ireland 3 years ago or 4 years ago, and the debates were that we can allow, you know, we can decriminalize, we can allow gay marriage, but we cannot allow abortion. That's not, we are so Catholic, it's a human being and other things. And now look, 69, 67%, you know, two-thirds.
And a gay prime minister,
So you're a gay prime minister. So you see human beings changing and accepting that some things we took as given are not necessarily where they are. So I think there's that part of it. And I think, I'll say, of course, that bureaucracies are perhaps their own different animals, you know. And having just touched around the UN, and when I see all this stuff around the UN, I keep thinking, you expect this UN to change? You don't know it. You don't know it well enough, I tell you. I mean, I think there's no place more resistant. And partly as well is that
why not? Why is the UN, why is there no place more resistant to change than the UN? Because that's quite a statement.
Yes, because I think, as she says, first of all, there's no benefit to doing anything right. The UN system and the culture that has evolved in the UN is that if you're not performing, the easiest way to deal with you is to promote you.
All right.
So
okay,
so
good
then
to know.
somebody you can go off, and so you see people rising fast. You know, those are not very competent people. So it encourages a culture of incompetence, encourages a culture of no whistleblowing, encourages a culture of just putting your head down and just keep your head down and move with it. So it's a whole system within the culture itself. But then the states, I mean, you know, we can talk about how we want to reform global governance. Of course, the easiest, the most reasonable thing is to deal with the veto powers that are there. But you can't ever move that debate because of personal interests that are there. But the UN is an interesting place, and I'm just working around it for 6 years. I encountered yet there are people within. That said, there are some fantastic people within there who will push the envelope and move it and say, let's work together. And I think a lot of it is those alliances with people outside of the UN, then they can always blame them for it. So they don't, so they're able to then survive within that environment. But I think when we get into a society where our livelihoods are tied to our jobs and our sense of being is tied to our jobs, then it makes things a lot harder. And I think that's where bureaucracies are there. And I think it would be interesting if we're going to think broadly and think about perhaps we shouldn't have permanent jobs for anybody. And you have 10 years you can work in the government, 10 years you're a politician and you move out, so people can be able to get out and be free. Maybe that's where we need to go.
Sounds like the House of Lords in the UK. I don't know how that is going.
Let's not go into that.
Let's not go into that. So collective responsibility, culture of incompetence. So let's talk about vested interests as well, because the phrase "turkeys don't vote for Christmas" has been mentioned, I think, twice during the day, in connection with the Security Council, I think, and reform of the Security Council. How do you tackle vested interest when you need to change things?
So that just strikes the heart of why and where you think change happens, really. And my fundamental belief is that it's not just about whether you vote for Christmas. It's any kind of change, really. It comes from seeing that there is pressure on you to do so, that there is a mandate for you to take action because the people who vote, or the people that with placards outside in the street, or the people buying stuff, want a particular kind of change. And I don't think it comes from anywhere else. Why would a system that is full of people who want things to be predictable and consistent, largely because of their makeup, why would they want change? It will only come when people rise up. So the thing that gets me excited about some of the things that have happened in the last year or so around different subjects is that at times there is out there in the world a kind of latent sense of something not being right. Now, every woman in this building will know that at some point in their life, someone has said something that's either inappropriate, who's been in a position of power, and you felt either uncomfortable at best, or you've been severely traumatized at worst. I would hazard that no woman has not felt that in the room, and that's probably true of everybody. And during that time, we all sense this, and then very many women are sort of active, but somehow change doesn't happen. And then suddenly, you have a lightning rod that strikes Harvey Weinstein. And suddenly, all of that latent sense of, well, this doesn't seem quite right, just bubbles up. And you get all sorts of things, and the kind of the positive things that will flow from what is actually a terribly negative thing that extend way beyond Hollywood, way beyond anything in the US, really, I would hope. And it is a very US-focused or European-focused thing, I admit, maybe. But I hope that we will have other lightning rods that will stimulate that other latent sense of, we all know that, the climate, we're going to hell in a handbasket, but we don't do very much. What is it that needs to be struck that makes us kind of release all of that potential? Because it's at that point that you get the political mandate, and that politicians will stand up, and vested interests aside, they will take notice.
So turkeys don't vote for Christmas, they need to be
They need
struck
to be
by
voted.
lightning. Yes. Okay, that's a different way of cooking them, I'm sure. Do you agree?
And I think a large part of it is people pressure. I think that's why I like protest, because people pressure is the key. And when you think about the South Koreans who were protesting for 27 Saturdays, 1 million people in Seoul, till the president's party could not support her anymore and impeached her. When you think of the work that's been done in Armenia around this, and people just keep going on, I mean, the world of change has always come with pressure. And then it makes people at the top, I think, at the top then respond to it and feel this is not for us to survive, because I think the other instinct is self-survival, survival instinct. So people start think, even though I don't want to change, but my survival instinct has kicked in, and here I have to adjust. So I think that happens then. The broader question I think that would be interesting to hear is how you deal, and this is something we're grappling with in many parts of Africa. How do you deal with societies that have become so rotten, cultures are so rotten, that corruption is seen as is normalized, is a normal thing? And so we're trying to figure out how you deal with that, because if we glorify theft, And I could very easily blame the colonial masters for some of these things, but I don't want to get there now. But when we glorify theft and we treat people who are thieves and stealing money as heroes and get them elected because they're thieves, there's something fundamentally wrong. There was a poll done of young Kenyans just last year between 18 and 25, and all of them, it was 70% said it is fine to be corrupt. That when you get into position of authority, 70% said it's okay. You can benefit. You should benefit from your position. So you've got this culture, and you're trying to figure out how do we then change it. So that's part of the cultural stuff that I think we have to work on, and there has to be a way in which we go back to the values that we had before of decency, caring for your brother and sister and your other people. So it's a struggle that is going on. So we can have all these reforms and transformations, but it has to go in with work at the cultural level as well, changing our personal cultures. And I think, and I'm happy to say that even within Africa, which was very, very homophobic, for example, you've seen trends that are shifting away from that. The fact is, in the 90s, the leaders of the anti-gay work in the UN system was Latin America, Africa, Muslim countries, and others. Today, Latin America is in the lead for pro-LGBT. It's Uruguay making resolutions, it's Argentina leading them, Colombia is out there in front. These are Catholic countries. So there was a cultural change that happened. And I think some of those things are fascinating for me to try and understand. At what stage did these very, very Catholic countries begin to understand that actually, whether you're gay, you're a man, you're a woman, you're human. And so let's deal with you as human rights, as a human being. And I think that for me is a fundamental part.
I'm going to turn to Marcus over there and see if there are any questions for the panel.
Okay, yeah. So let's start with this one. We discussed a bit of sort of the role of young people in sort of making change. And so one question from Philip Peters via Twitter. Early UN employment is often unpaid. Located in some of the most expensive cities in the world, often only leading to several temporary contracts before full-time employments. So, how can we make this more inclusive?
That's the UN.
UN, yes.
Oh, I tell you, I mean, I've got friends who move around the UN in Geneva, working from month to month or 3 months contract, 3 months contract. And what it does do, unfortunately, with that kind of a process is that it makes sure that only people who can be in Geneva, and I'm using this because that's human rights, the Center of Human Rights in the UN, the only people who can be in Geneva are Europeans, because they don't need visas and work permits. You're European, you can go to Switzerland and live there. You have to find a way to get a job in case you lose it. So it warps and changes things. So this is one of the places where I think their employment policies do not tie with the values that the UN has. And it's not just Geneva, it's the same in New York, it's the same in Nairobi, same wherever the UN is. And it's something that the UN needs to come through on that. But I think, let me say this, I think for young people who want to make a difference, I wouldn't say go to the UN immediately. That shouldn't be your first, should not be your first choice, you know. Do that after you think, okay, now I have done all this hard work on the ground. Yeah. Now I need some, because, you know, they pay pretty well. The UN pays very well compared to many places. Actually, the UN rules are that the UN salaries must be higher than the highest paid civil service in the world. So it makes it well paid. So before you go to the EU or UN to work, just do something harder and real, you know, something a bit harder. You'll be the better for it actually by the time you join these institutions, and you'll retain some values about the reason why you're doing this work. So I think that's a part of it that becomes difficult. If you want to make a career in the UN because it's a career, and you don't maintain a link to why you want to do it, then it becomes a problem.
Helen, you're nodding?
What he said,
yes,
basically.
What he said, okay. Efficient. Do we have another question?
Yeah, sure. So we've also been discussing this sort of bottom-up, top-down approaches. Yeah. So we have a question from Earl James on this topic. So the question is, would a UN Parliamentary Assembly help unite local, global, and be a balancing force to the gridlocked UN Security Council?
Ooh. Helen, do you want to say something?
Yes, but can I sort of not quite answer that question?
Okay, you can.
It's slightly too difficult for me. I think the question of top-down and bottom-up is really interesting one, because I agree with what you're saying about it's both and. But there is a sort of an emerging assumption at the moment that everything that is top-down is to be viewed with suspicion. It's quite a pejorative term to say the words top-down. And equally, everything that's bottom-up is deemed to be correct because it came from bottom-up. And it's almost blasphemy to suggest that things that emerge from communities are not quite right. And both of those things are wrong. And really, the challenge, the central question is the connection. What is the kind and the quality of relationship that exists between something that is a top-down institution and something amorphous, non-hierarchical, and sort of fluid as a community? And I think you see that manifested at every single level of government. How does an institution that has a particular structure engage and relate to these things that are not? And you see it sort of, whether it's trying to engage in the collaborative economy, so these new networks that are organising, coordinating in new ways, whether it's engaging with a community that's been marginalised. The real heroes, I should probably say, I think, are the local governments, and what I mean by local government is sort of city level or sub-regional governments who have those hierarchies, they have those top-down structures, including political membership, but are very, very close to the lived experiences of their people, and they're having to make all sorts of changes. And that's, I think, that layer, so city level and below, is where you see the most interesting innovation, the most interesting emergent practice around participatory budgeting, different forms of decision making, co-ownership of public services and delivery, and co-ownership of community assets. And when I was listening this morning about some of the conversations that are sort of happening up here with the UN, actually, there is so much to learn for how local government is looking at this, that we would do well to strengthen our networks with those sub-regional actors, if only to learn, because they're doing it already.
City level and below, do you agree?
Or in top,
That's where it's happening.
Yeah, I mean the local, again, local councils depends which country you're in, and it's very country specific in a sense, and which regions you're at, because I can point to local governments in places which are almost appointed because gerrymandering and politics. So there's a central question as well to go back to about the quality of democracy that is there. And I think one of the problems we've had in the world over the last 10, 15 years is that we've equated voting with democracy. And those are two very different things, you know. So the Western world became it's a quick fix. You're hearing this now every time there's anything. Let's have elections in Libya. Let's have elections in this. And it takes much more than just voting and elections to have democracy. You need to have institutions. You need to have things building up. You need to have accountabilities that are built in. My issue, I think, through all these things is the question of accountability. How do you hold those responsible accountable? That to me is a question, and that can be done at the top, it can be done at the bottom, and I think if you can find systems and structures and ways, whether they are public ways or they are institutional ways, they are through the court system, they are through just marginalizing people who are making bad decisions. There's got to be a way to do it. But accountability is the key to any governance system, to be honest. I think nothing, because there's no perfection, there's no perfect society, and no perfect institution, no perfect governance system. So the question then to make it better is always got to be, how accountable is it to us? How responsive is it to us? How do we participate in it? I think that then will take care of bottom up in very many ways. But I see the role of both top down, top
Top
up,
down and bottom up.
bottom up and top down.
Top up, bottom down.
Helen, maybe finally some advice from you, because we have these ideas being presented here today. They will be taken forward during the next 2 days of the forum, to then actually implement them and to actually change things. What do we need to keep in mind?
So when I was listening to them, I was a few thoughts struck me. One of them, which is a central question, which is who's round the table that's going to experiment? So it would be amazing, I'm sure the UN Director General isn't still here, I'm not sure if he is, but a brilliant if he sort of said, okay, well, whatever comes out of here, it may not be a fully formed thing, but we will absorb some of that, and we'll create a space where we can experiment and use that kind of way of connecting innovators with institutions that brings in the pull. So much of what happens in social innovation and entrepreneurship and all of that kind of economy is that everyone pushes the new ideas, and the support and the finance goes to the people who have the new idea, and they don't go towards the people whose lives are going to be made a nightmare, and you need to bring them with you. And so I think those solutions that aren't over-engineered, that when you strip away the technology, the fundamentals still make sense. And where you can tangibly see that someone somewhere in some position of power is going to be comfortable experimenting with it. Because I think it's great to model what a new vision could be, but if you want to turn that model into reality, you can draw a rocket, but doesn't make it a rocket. So you need to make sure that all those pictures of rockets that we were given have some semblance and grounding in reality. That's only made possible by being confident and comfortable and willing to adapt and flex in response to the environment in which you want that to be taken hold.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Maina. Thank you.